Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here. Violin, bows and bowing, action, gestures. The reason why I'm here is a coil with resistance wires of different gauges. 30 years ago in 1983, I found that coil in the lab, and I had no intention whatsoever at that time to study bow motion. But a couple of days later, I was struck by the idea that the thin gauge of that wires would be perfect for that purpose. So that's the reason I'm here. The coil is still existing. We will return to that in a minute. Will present many works together with Knut Gyttler. He passed away a month ago, very unexpectedly. It's a great loss, and I'm very sad about that. He was a great musician, a great thinker, and a great scientist. He has meant a lot to the understanding of bowing and bow actions. I will also talk about work by Erwin Schondewald and Matthias Democron. They have both been here at McGill during rather long times, at least Erwin, and they were PhD students in Paris and at Stockholm at KTH. I brought a violin player on stage because music makes life easier. A big hand for Lambert Chen. He will perform some demonstrations during the talk. So, bowing gestures. That's difficult. Please, Lambert. Thank you. And can you play the open G string as well? Yeah. Thank you. Even the last example is difficult, and we will explain why in a minute. Thank you. We can think of bowing gestures as highly complex movement patterns, simultaneously controlling the sound of the current note and preparing for what to come. And of course, bowing is very explicit to the eye. You think that you understand what the violin player is doing, but so it's tempting to look at bow motion as a wide open window or gateway for analysis of music performance, the real music performance, the high-level analysis. And that might very well be true, but it's important to keep in mind that much of a bow control reflects the need to adapt to the physical constraints of the bowed string. The player is restricted, and not everything is possible in every moment. And with that in mind, we could continue and note that the bow motion control operates on different levels. There is one short-sighted level, on the note level, to do now, exactly now and not later. And that deals with the quality of the tone production, the attack and build up to a periodic steady state. It deals with the timing of a current note, it deals with the dynamic level and the timbre. And it deals with the articulation, meaning that how should this current note be separated from the following note. And all that requires a continuous coordination of a set of independent or almost independent bowing parameters. And they are around 5, 6, 7. And the other time perspective is much longer. What's in the pipeline, which on that needs planning in advance. Crescendo, diminuendo over several bars are typical examples, and phrasing, of course, over 8 bars or even longer sometimes. I have divided the presentation in 7 chapters, and I hope that will be something for all of you in at least one of the chapters. And the first one is rather long, eine kurze Einführung, the bowed string and Helmholtz. Here is Hermann von Helmholtz lecturing. He was the first one who studied the bow motion the bowed string scientifically. So he used the high-tech equipment of his time, the vibration microscope invented by Lisa Schuh in Paris. So here is the string, and it's bowed in this direction, and he observed a spot on the string through the lens of a microscope, and that lens is mounted on a prong of a tuning fork, which is driven by an electromagnet. So he could, in that case, with this equipment, he could slow down the motion of the vibrating string and observe what happened. And looking through the microscope, he saw this strange figure. And after thinking for a while, he said that, the motion of this point on the string, which I observe, the motion of that versus time is a sawtooth wave, string displacement. And the corresponding string velocity is a pulse train. The period is divided into phases, one sticking phase during which the string sticks to the bow hair and moves with the same velocity and in the same direction as the bow. So this is the bow velocity. And that is followed by the much shorter phase, the slipping phase, during which the string slips back under the string opposite to the bowing direction. The velocity of that is much, much higher. Very good. And he was right. Here is the bowed string motion observed by modern techniques. The string's displacement is a sawtooth wave, and the string velocity is a pulse train. And of course, these are real signals, so there are extra features introduced here. We have some ripples, and we have some rounding of the corners, etc. They are real physical processes, and they have never showed discontinuities. So he was right. Very good. Helmholtz also said that if you look at the entire string, between the bridge and between the nut, you will see that the string is in every moment composed of two straight lines, this, and they are connected at the corner, the so-called Helmholtz corner. So this corner circulates on the string envelope, and the number of round trips is set by the frequency of a fundamental mode of a string. So playing on the famous A string on the violin, the corner completes 440 round trips per second. And on the A string on the double bass, it completes 55 round trips per second. Changing bowing direction, in this case from down to up, reverses the circulation direction in the envelope. Yes, today there are many nice animations of the Helmholtz motion available on the internet, and I'm particularly fond of this from Oberlin College and Conservatory. So here is the bridge, here is the nut, here is the bow moving upwards, and when sticking is occurring, this dot is present, and here is the Helmholtz corner. Let's go. Here comes the corner sticking, now release and slipping and capture, and now sticking. The corner is reflected at the nut, and soon initiates slipping here, and then capture and sticking again. And then we can perhaps add the displacement graph. So an observation point is here. So we see this sawtooth wave shape. Very good, thank you. Back to business. Back to the violinist controls, the bowing parameters. They are three, the main ones. It's the bow velocity, here. It's the bow bridge distance, often by player call that contact point. And it's the bow force which is pressing force against the string, called the bow pressure by players. And the bow bridge distance is often referred to as relative bowing position, and then it's normalized to the speaking length of a string, L here. Then it's called beta. We will use that later. It turns out that the string displacement amplitude is proportional to the bow velocity and inversely proportional to the bow bridge distance. So these two bowing parameters can be traded off against each other to obtain one and the same string velocity, string vibration amplitude, as the player wants. Little surprisingly, perhaps, the bow force does not influence the string amplitude at all, and neither does the bow position, the contact point between with the string relative to the frog or the tip. But from a player's perspective, it's of course a very different situation playing close to the tip and frog, but it doesn't influence the amplitude of the string vibrations. We could put numbers on this, but we don't need that now, so we proceed. What's needed is dry friction between bow and string, and that's a basic requirement. Dry friction means that the friction coefficient is higher the lower the relative velocity between the bow and string. So in a graph of friction force between bow and string and the velocity of a string at the bowing point, dry friction has such a characteristic. The friction coefficient is highest during stick when the relative velocity is 0 between bow and string. And as soon as it starts to slip a little, the friction coefficient drops and drops and drops, so slipping occurs somewhere here under very low friction coefficient. And in order to obtain dry friction, you put rosin on the bow. And if you oil the bow, you get a completely inverse friction characteristic, and the violin is muted completely. Helmholtz motion requires rosined surfaces, not oiled. Rounded Helmholtz corner, what's that? Well, this is very interesting. The ideal Helmholtz motion is not influenced by the bow force, as I said a minute ago. But in reality, the influence of bow force on the waveforms is large. And the reason for that is damping in the string and at the bridge reflections and string stiffness, also called inharmonicity. That makes the Helmholtz corner rounded during propagation from the bridge to nut and back again. So instead of this nice sharp Helmholtz corner, you get a rounded corner with some extension along the string. And that is visible in the string velocity waveform as rounded pulses as well. Now, that rounding is counterbalanced by a resharpening of the Helmholtz corner with each time the string is released from the string. And as we saw on the animation, that occurs once every round trip. And here is the actual point. The resharpening effect is larger the higher the bow force. So there is a balance between rounding and resharpening, and the amount of resharpening is determined by the player via the bow force. And the sharper Helmholtz corner corresponds to sharper bow velocity pulses as well, and that means stronger high harmonics in the string spectrum, according to the famous theorem by Fourier. So in conclusion, the bow force controls the high frequency content, and which in perceptual terms is related to brilliance. It does not influence the string vibration amplitude as such, but the high frequency content. Very good. This effect of resharpening is pronounced. Here is two classical figures by John Schelling illustrating that. There is a stiff and lossy string bowed with increasing bow force. And here is a low force, and you see that's almost a sinusoidal motion, only the fundamental present in the string spectrum. And with the increasing bow force, you get the typical Helmholtz motion with sharp corners, relatively sharp corners, and steep slopes in velocity. And that corresponds in the spectral domain to a much increased high frequency content. Here is partial number or partial frequency and partial amplitude. So the difference between the low bow force and the high bow force is not very pronounced for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 partials. But then the high frequency boost by increasing bow force is dramatic, perhaps say 15, 20 dB in this case. So that's good. So in summary now, the violin player has 2 controls for dynamic level and timbre. There is 1 volume knob, and that shifts the entire string spectrum up and down if you use a logarithmic scale in dB, and it doesn't change the relations between the partials. So this gain or volume control that is related to the bow velocity and the bow bridge distance, which can be traded off against each other according to these relations as we saw earlier. And the other knob is the treble knob. That's for the brilliance, and that's connected with the bow force. A wonderful instrument with separate controls for volume and treble. And in that respect, it's a close cousin to the human voice, the singing voice, where the controls are to a large extent independent. And it's in contrast to the clarinet and trumpet and other wind instruments to a rather large extent. Yes, before proceeding with must say few words on the bow hold and bow force. Here is the violin bow, and the bow hold is light. You don't cramp your fingers around the frog. And that means that the bow can pivot almost freely around a virtual axis through the fingers, thumb and middle index fingers here. Also indicated here is a pivoting axis, a virtual axis not existing in reality, of course. And the downward force is supplied by the index finger. That gives a torque in this direction. And a torque in opposite direction, balancing the gravity, can be applied by the little finger here, if necessary. And a torque balance gives a reaction force here to the string, which is the bow force. And we notice here that if you are close to the tip, for a certain torque, you get a lower bow force close to the tip, because this lever, the x distance to the axis, is increased. So if you really need a high bow force, you should play close to the frog. And if you would like to control a low bow force in detail, it's good to be close to the tip. Yes, now we leave the bow. Now comes the bad news, the Schelling Triangle. It's one of the most cited figures in the literature of music acoustics. Probably the most cited figure. It's cluttered with information, impossible to understand the first 10 times you read the article, but we will, for us it's sufficient to understand it's a visualization of a playable parameter space for steady-state bowing. And it gives the limits for maximum and minimum bow force versus the relative position from the bridge. So the bridge is somewhere here, and the beta, relative distance from the bridge, is on the x-axis. In order to get with this Helmholtz motion, the normal motion, you have to be within this triangle. And we will now ask Maestro to step forward on stage and demonstrate what happens if you don't don't respect these limits. So if you are above the upper limit, you press much too hard. What do we get then? Please, Maestro. Thank you. You get a raucous motion, which might be interesting in contemporary music, but not in early type of music. If you press too little, so that you are below the lower limit, Maestro. You get what's called multiple slipping and a surface tone. You don't have any grip of a string at all. But if you are within the Schelling Triangle, you get the wonderful Helmholtz motion, please. Very nice, thank you. Okay, we look at this Schelling Triangle in more detail now. Here, let's assume we respect the maximum or minimum bore force limits. We are within the triangle, so we get the Helmholtz motion. And here we have certain leeway margins. We can increase the bow force to a certain, close to the upper limit, and by that we increase the brilliance, we know, as we said a minute ago. But you still have a Helmholtz motion. And Schelling indicated this possibility that you can play with a normal timbre here, rather far from the bridge, or you can choose to play with a more brilliant timbre closer to the bridge and with a much higher bow force. But if you decrease the bow bridge distance, you also increase the string amplitude. So if you don't reduce the bow velocity, you have sort of changed dynamic level. But that can be balanced, of course. You can trade off the decrease in bow bridge distance with a lower velocity. So you keep a certain dynamic level, but you change the timbre, the amount of brilliance. So the normal strategy for changing dynamic level now for a string player from piano to forte would be to play with piano here, far away from a bridge with low bow force, and then decrease the bow bridge distance and increase bow pressure force so you get up close to the apex of a triangle in fortissimo. And then you get both larger string vibration and amplitude and more brilliance, which is very good for the high louder levels. We can leave that for a moment. Here comes more bad news, Güttler's triangle, because and that deals with the attacks. It's a visualization of playable parameter space during attacks. It gives them limits, the maximum limit and the minimal limit for bow force during attack versus the bow acceleration, not the distance between bow and bridge in this case. And in these different regions, 1, 2, 3, you get different qualities of the attacks. So if, please Lambert, step forward and demonstrate if you press too hard in relation to the acceleration, you got what you call the choked, creaky attack with prolonged periods before the Helmholtz develop. Please. Once again, please, it was beautiful. Yeah, we are here. And then follows the right amount of bow force, so you get perfect periodic Helmholtz from the first start. Please. Once again. And finally, in the third region, here you had, it's a loose attack, the bow pressure is too low, in comparison to acceleration, and you get a very long transient, which might develop into Helmholtz eventually. Please. Too low bow pressure. Once again. Ah, thank you. Very good. I had recorded examples available, but these are live demonstrations exceeded by far the quality of these recorded ones. You don't need to produce perfect attacks all the time, not even as a professional player. A professional perhaps produce perfect attacks in 50% for all notes, but the prolonged period attacks and the multiple slipping periods they produce are short, perhaps 10 periods or so, and that's okay. If you concentrate, you can play perfect attacks, perhaps a series of 50, but then you need to concentrate. Yes, that was chapter 1. Now chapter 2, are the basics right? Does Schelling's triangle exist is one question, and that has been studied using Boeing machines of different design. Here is one from KTH. You might see the bow here. Here's a frog, and the stick and the bow hair. And the bowing machines are computer controlled, so you know exactly the acceleration, the velocity, the bow force, and everything. So you can make large systematic explorations of the bow parameter spaces. And there is one machine available in Cambridge as well for the cello. Yes, Schelling exists. The Schelling Triangle does really exist. Above that, you have a raucous regime. Below that, you have a multiple slipping regime. And here are the borders for the triangle. So that was very relieving to see. It took 40 years after Schelling's publication to do this. But now it has been done. Was Güttler right with his triangle for the attacks? Yes, the large picture is right. And that's good. And the Schelling of a player's strategy from going from pianissimo to forte, as we talked about a minute ago. Here are two subjects playing piano, mezzo, forte, forte. And yes, they do as predicted. They decrease beta, increase bow force, and move towards the apex of the Schelling triangle, while they respect the upper and lower limits. So everything is okay so far. And brilliance, how much do you get by increasing bow force? And we know the physical quantity related for brilliance is spectral centroid, which has a high correlation with perceived brightness or brilliance. So here are two examples of spectra with different spectral centroids. So red ones contains more high frequency. Here are spectral centroid maps overlaid on Schelling triangle with a large study with the bowing machine. And we see the color coding runs from 800 Hertz dark blue to 3000 Hertz for dark red. And if you want to increase brilliance, that it's not a good idea to decrease beta because nothing happens. You're still in the blue area. It's much better to increase the bow force going in that direction. So the strategy would be to move this in this direction towards the desirable high frequency parts in the Schelling triangle. And you get about 2 or even more, 2000 Hertz change in spectral centroid from here to here, which is rather dramatic. Pitch flattening is a very pronounced effect in professional solo playing. We can have questions about that later if you want, but we leave that for the moment being. So the string player's guide to brilliance has a little more than that, this Schelling triangle, but that's the basic rule. Increase the bow force, as we just talked about. And the change you get in spectrum is rather large, and the change in string spectrum, which corresponds to this increase in spectral centroid. Here the bow force is doubled, and then you get 4 to 6 dB contribution in the high frequency range from partial 15 and upwards by increasing bow force. But there are two other tricks as well. The next is to reduce the bow velocity. Reduce the bow velocity. Here it's reduced by a factor of 3 from the blue compared to red. And that increases the high frequency content as well. So you get, in addition, you get 2 to 6 dB increase here just by reducing the bow force. And that the reason is that a lower bow velocity gives a faster capture of a string waveform. And the third rule is to tilt the bow, lean the bow stick towards the fingerboard so we're reducing the width of the bow hair in contact with the string. And that gives 3 to 6 dB as well in this range. You don't tilt the bow so much in loud playing, but this is a trick to maintain brilliance at soft dynamic levels. A narrow bow gives faster release, it can be shown. So that's the cookbook for brilliance. Next chapter, how to study bowing. That's an interesting issue. People started early. Here's a wonderful book from 1920s by Trendelenburg. Die natürlichen Grundlagen der Kunst des Streichinstrumentspiels. And he had no electronics available, so he would design complicated machines. And you might, for registration of the bow motion and the string vibrations. You might see violin here somewhere in the machine. He was a medical doctor and tried to set rules for natural bow motion on physiological basis. Very impressive work in view of what he had available in technical equipment. 1930s, an important study by Percival Hodgson. He used cyclographs, that is light bulbs mounted on the hand and fingers and other parts to make an early version of motion capture. And he showed that the bowing motions they never follow straight lines. So he introduced the term crooked bowing, and which evoked a lively discussion about how to teach violin playing. The straight bowing had been the golden reference for many, many years. And here is KTH in the early 80s. I put my thin resistance wire in the bundle of bow hair, so it made electrical contact with the string at this point. We're using a metal string. And then the bow hair was divided in one short and one long part with two resistance values. And that could be used in an electrical circuit, which is called whetstone bridge. So I could measure the position of the bow at every instant, and from that I got velocity. And at the same time now the string here is divided in a short part, which is the bow bridge distance, and a long part to the nut. So I used that in a second whetstone bridge, so I got the bow bridge distance. And then I used the strain gauges to measure the deflection of the bow hair at the tip and at the frog. So I got the bow force. So I had all three main bowing parameters at hand, although the technique was very simple. And later others developed more sophisticated techniques. Here's MIT in 97, the hyper bow with electrical field sensing for positions, and other sensors as well. It never gave any scientific footprint in the literature, though. The augmented violin at IRCAM, they also used electrical field sensing and other sensors. And that was used for classifying bow styles automatically. Détaché, martelé, spiccato, successfully. And later, of course, more ambitious projects capturing the full sets of bowing parameters by motion capture. And here's one example from Barcelona, the music technology group, which used the electromagnetic field system for tracking all coordinates of bow and violin. And they made a very impressive and ambitious project of modeling, high-level modeling of violin performance gestures by using this technique. So they collected complete sheets with bowing parameter data for different musical examples. And here at McGill, Erwin Schondewald was here in 2008, and made a long visit and used motion capture techniques to obtain complete sets of the parameters, including the bowing angles, tilt, skewness, and inclination, and we will return to that. We recognize Lambert-Chen as one of the subjects. And Matthias Democron developed a robust and reliable bow force transducer, which was used in combination with that. So they created picture books of different bowing examples with all parameters included. Bow position, bow velocity, bow bridge distance, bow force, bow acceleration, tilt, skewness, and string played and bowing direction. A lot of data which is not fully analyzed yet in all details. And before leaving this exposé over methods, it's interesting to note in how many ways bows and bowing has been used to try to control synthesis or new musical instruments. These are examples from before 2000. And here are later examples of extended violins or extended bows. And of course, this interest in bows and bowing is due to people think that this gives an expressive control of the instrument. That bowing is an excellent means of controlling many types of instruments, and that might be the case. Next chapter. That's about, I think it's here. Yeah, chapter 4. Violin bowing, how and why. Here we see the viola section in orchestra. They are very concentrated, and the reason is that they are moving a wooden stick back and forth. Under controlled conditions, we should add. This is difficult, as Lambert demonstrated. There are two reflections to this. One is the horsetail. It's a lucky coincidence that the length of a good horsetail equals that of a sweeping gesture by the arm. Lambert, please take place on stage. Very good. Thank you. This wonderful legato playing with long cantilena lines would be impossible if the horsetails were short, because there's absolutely still no proper substitute to horsehair. It's rather expensive also. So thanks for the horses. Reflection 2, between the devil and the deep blue sea. The distance between the frog and the tip is 64 centimeters, no less, no more. And a key issue in bowing is to use that distance in a sensible way. It takes some years to do that. Even the simplest bowing gestures reveal a key issue, and that's coordination of the bowing parameters. And it might not come as a surprise, of course. Coordination is needed in playing of all kinds of instruments, the trumpet, clarinet, the singing, and of course the piano and guitar. But in bowing, the coordination, the importance of coordination becomes so explicitly clear when you study the bowing parameters. So it's very tempting to underline that requirement. We will look at a few simple examples of that to convince you. So here is basics 1A, détaché, also separated long notes, played back and forth, down bow, up bow, at mezzo forte. And this use data from the old KTH studies with its simple equipment. Not because these are particularly good, but because they are rather clear in demonstrating these issues, coordination issues I was talking about. There are later examples with more precision. So let's see now, what have we got? Here is bow position. So the contact point between string and bow runs from the frog towards the tip in a down bow, and then back again in up bow, down, up, down, up. And the velocity is about 20 centimeter per second in both directions, back, down, up, down, up. And the bow bridge distance is about 25 millimeter, rather constant, and the bow force is about 1 Newton. And that gives a steady vibration level in the violin, except that the bow changes. So where is the coordination here, you may well ask? Well, the blue, the green, and the red curves are coordinated, because otherwise they are within the Schelling Triangle. Otherwise you would not get the Helmholtz motion. And here's another second player with the same task, and he has a completely different interpretation of the dynamic level, mezzo forte. He uses the shorter bow bridge distance, 20 compared to 25, much higher bow force, 2 Newton instead of 1. And the vibration level is perhaps 10 or almost 10 dB higher. So he chooses another coordination point in the Schelling Triangle. So by such examples, you can explore the strategies violinists use for playing a piano mezzo forte. So they decrease the bow bridge distance from piano to forte. In this case, we keep the velocity rather constant because we have to save the bow because it's long notes. You can't spend too much of the bow with high velocity. And one player even decreased the velocity towards forte. And we know that now that is a trick to increase brilliance. And they have to increase the bow force to stay within the Schelling Triangle due to these changes. And what you get is increased by 4 or 5 dB for each dynamic step in the vibration level of a violin body. So that's a way of coordinating with parameters in playing at different dynamic levels. Here is a more difficult, complex example, crescendo, diminuendo, up, down. Yes, these are slow changes, so they decrease the bow bridge distance in the crescendo. They increase the velocity as well in order to increase the string vibration amplitude, according to this relation. And they have to and want to increase the bow force as well to coordinate that changes. They get a nice build-up, perhaps 20 or 25 dB from pianissimo to fortissimo. And then back again. And of course it can be played in the reverse direction, down, up, but then you get the same picture for the coordination of bowing parameters. That's the same, but here the player is in an awkward situation because you need a high bow force when you're playing close to a tip. Here is the tip. So that's not so, a little awkward. Here is an example of, you can read it anyway. It's a live solo performance with many people watching, to say the least. And watch how he uses the bow bridge distance in crescendo and in diminuendo. Yeah, it must be here. And this one. And now we can play. So he uses 1 decimeter of the string length of his cello to vary the bow bridge distance during the diminuendo crescendi. He knows how the string physics. Is it here? Yeah. And here is an even more complicated example from the previous series, forzando. It requires a short and strong attack, so that's a rapid change. So you use the bow velocity to do that because that can be changed fast. But the long and soft sustained part which follows, there you have a low bow velocity and a slight increase in bow bridge distance to further reduce the dynamic level. And the bow force is coordinated with these two changes, mainly the velocity change. And you get a nice attack with perhaps 30 dB change from here to here, and then a sustained part. And finally, spiccato, crescendo, diminuendo. The same procedure, decrease the bow bridge distance in crescendo, increase the bow velocity, and that is made here rather interesting. There is only one way to do that, and that is to make the bow strokes longer, because the note rate is set by the tempo. So use a longer part of the bow with a higher velocity. And the bow force is coordinating with these changes. And you get the nice crescendo, diminuendo, while the bow is bouncing all the time, making these short strokes. Coordination is the word. And there is not much to learn by studying the bowing parameters one at a time. You must have a full picture, otherwise you're lost. Typical values, we can leave that for a moment being. Here more basic data 20 years later from the mocap measurements here at McGill, an extensive study with many players, studies of all 4 strings, many kinds of durations, long and short and very short notes, and crescendo, diminuendo, all kinds. And essentially the same picture develops. And we don't need to dwell on that, but it's very good to see that from a larger material that the strategies hold. We can spend a second on the player profiles because that's interesting. Here we have different durations. Here are 16 notes played at forte, mezzo forte, pianissimo, and we have a bow force here, bow velocity here, and bow bridge distance down here. And here is player 6. He is a high bow force player. He uses high bow forces in all dynamic levels relative to the others. And they use high velocities for the 16 notes here relative to the others. But he doesn't use a bow bridge distance at all, almost to discriminate between the dynamic levels. And he should be contrasted against player 5, because she is a low force player, but only less than half of a bow force compared to the red, and about half the velocity. But she uses the bow bridge distance instead to change the dynamic level. So there are different styles obtained in different schools of interpreting the same task. It's also relieving to see that they respect the Schelling limits. Here's the upper bow force limit. They keep a certain margin to that, but they are on the edge for the lower limit. So they are at risk for multiple slipping and soft dynamic levels. The timbre control, the spectral centroid. How much change in spectral centroid do we get from pianissimo to forte? Rather much, in fact. Plus 2 kilohertz by the component from the bow force alone, and an additional 1 kilohertz from decreasing the bow velocity. Yes, so the strategy holds. And finally, they tilt the bow all the time. Violin players tilt the bow. And tilting means that you lean the stick towards the fingerboard so less hair are in contact with the string. And that makes the bow more compliant. It makes the bow more softer. But the tilting is adapted to 2 things. One is the dynamic level. So here is the tilt angle from 0 to 45 degrees in forte, mezzo forte, pianissimo. Long notes played at these dynamic levels. So they tilt much at soft dynamic levels, about 25 degrees on average in pianissimo compared to 10 degrees in forte. And this large tilt at the soft levels is, of course, a way you get more refined control of the bow force. The bow is more compliant, so a certain change in the motion of your hand makes less difference in bow force. But the tilt also depends on the position on the bow, so we tilt more close to the frog. Here's the bow position, running between the frog, tip, and frog. So close to the frog, the tilting is excessive, 30 degrees, and not so much at the tip, perhaps 10 degrees. So more tilt close to the frog depends. You want a more forgiving bow, which is less sensitive to the shaking hand in bow and the bow hand movements. Here is a live example of tilting. Watch closely. here. He starts with strokes close to the frog. Excessive tilting with stick is almost touching the strings, and so he plays on the edge of the bow hair. And now he makes a long bow. And here at the tip, the bow is flat on the string with all hairs in contact. So the tilting is changed continuously during the bow stroke for the reasons we have mentioned here. Next chapter is about, what's on the agenda? Is it here? Yeah. Here is an important thing. 2 tricky issues. What time is it? Bouncing bow and smooth bow changes. And the young violin player is concentrated because this is difficult to do. Bouncing bow strokes, spiccato or sautelier, little depending on tempo. It uses a bouncing bow with alternating up and down bows. So please, Lambert, give an example of, let's say, sautelier, fast bouncing notes. Thank you. So you easily produce 10 notes per second with the bouncing bow, if you want to. The spiccato sautelier is made possible by the bouncing modes of the bow. And the bow can bounce on the string because the bow hole is light, as we said a few minutes ago. There is a virtual pivoting axis at the frog in the bow grip. That combined with the existence of the deflected bow hair, the red line here, and the inertia of the bow stick, which together makes up a mass spring system, an oscillating system, makes bouncing possible. And this bouncing is useful because of another reason, and that because the bounce frequency varies along the position along the bow. From about 6 hertz here, close to the frog, to up to 30 hertz close to the tip. And the typical spiccato rate is about 9 to 12 notes per second, so that's close to the middle of the bow, as Lambert used now when he played these fast sequences. Yes, so the spiccato point is here. So let's look now at a few notes in the perfect spiccato. Here are 4 spiccato notes, up, down, with the bouncing bow. And the thin lines here are we look at the string velocity. So the thin lines represent 1 period each. They are shows the slipping velocity for each period. So the notes are short. I can't count here, perhaps 30 periods in total for 1 note. So each note is characterized by a relatively fast build-up, a fast decay, and then a very clear muting of a string before the next note starts. There is a clear separation to the next note, which gives the crisp spiccato. And that requires a certain coordination between these bouncing components, this rotational motion of the bow, in relation to the translational motion of the up and down bows, back and forth. And if you have a right coordination, you could observe a pattern of 8 if you put a marker at the middle of the bow stick. If you don't have a right coordination, you will see other patterns here. So now, if we look at these 2 notes in more detail, we will see how about the coordination. So here is again the down bow, perhaps 25 periods or so, and the up bow, and the string velocity. And the red curve is the velocity of the bow. A down bow, up bow, a sinusoidal shape of the bow velocity. And the bow force is a green curve, also sinusoidal, except when it has bounced off the string, because then the force is 0. So let's see now, here the bow is on the string. There is a build up in string amplitude because the bow velocity increases. But now it's time for free flight. So the bow bounces off, and there's a free decay of the string vibration. Nothing drives the string any longer. Soon, here follows the next, the landing of the bow on the string, and there is a force decay because now the bow velocity is very low. There's a muting, and the muting is terminated by the bow change. The vibration of the first note is effectively terminated by the bow change, and then follows a gap to the next note before it has gained sufficient velocity to start a slip period. So that synchronization is needed in a crisp, perfect spiccato. Again, coordination. Here's another example which Lambert will demonstrate, the ricochet. And then you give one impulse by the bow hand, and that starts a series of short bouncing notes in one stroke. And here is first the famous theme from Wilhelm Tell, 2 ricochet notes followed by a spiccato. Please. Very good. Can you take something from Mendelssohn? Thank you. And this is, in a sense, I stress, in a sense, simpler than the spiccato, because you don't need to mute the notes in the ricochet. You just continue, let it bounce once again, because the Helmholtz corner is circulating in the same direction for all ricochet notes. But it's a very effective way of producing a sequence of crisp or fast short notes. Yeah, smooth bow changes is a completely under question. The bow is not particularly long, so there is in some cases a need to extend the bow by inaudible bow changes. And there are different strategies for that. So the problem is at some point the bow must come to a full stop, because you can't change the direction otherwise. And the other problem is that the Helmholtz corner needs to change rotation direction between the up-down versus following up bow. And how should that be done? The solution seems to be to hide the onset of the second note by masking, a perceptual trick. So that means you stop the old note relatively fast and start the second note with a perfect attack. That means without scratches and with a slow build up. And that's illustrated here. These pictures are from a completely unknown PhD dissertation from Melbourne, dealing with bow changes only. Very impressive work. This is an example of a danger of not publishing good work in journal articles. Nobody reads it. So here's the sound level for a smooth change compared to a rough change. Here's a down bow with this average level. Here follows the bow change. And look here, the second note is started very gradually with a slow build up in sound level. And that leaves the second note in the shadow of the first one, a masking effect. And you should by all means avoid such disturbing bumps, like here in the rough change. And that occurs easily if you want to regain the same amplitude, the same sound level of the second note as for the first, directly, very quickly after the bow change. It's much better to do like that. The other issue is how you get the perfect start of a second note without scratches and without a long intermission in between. That requires a fast retardation, a fast stopping of a first note. You see it here. Also, here's the frictional force plotted, but it might be easier to see here in the string velocity. And then follows a silent gap between T1 and T2 before the amplitude of a second note has had time to build up. You can look at here. In this case, you have seemed to have lost about 10 periods, and that's rather much. That might not, perhaps not pass as an inaudible. 10 periods of a lowest, on the low string of a violin is 200 milliseconds. No, 20 milliseconds, yeah. 50. I was thinking about another instrument. Yeah, 50 milliseconds. Here, in contrast, is a very successful bow change from that dissertation I mentioned. There's a string velocity here, and here's a microphone signal. A fast retardation and some missing periods, and then a slow build-up. And here he managed to lose only 5 periods. So that might well pass as an inaudible bow change. And the tricks to do that, the practical tricks is to, one way is to keep the right hand, the frog, moving with constant speed, but within a certain trajectory, like that, for example, so that we change the bowing direction here, but the hand is moving with constant speed all the time. That might be easier. And with this trajectory, you get the fast retardation and a slower build-up. And in contrast with this semicircular trajectory, the bow change is delayed, and you get a symmetrical figure with the long retardation and an equal long acceleration. And that's not so good, probably. Yes, that was about smooth bow changes, tricky things to do. Here comes a most interesting chapter. Bow and timbre. Does the bow influence the sound of a violin? Yes, indeed, according to players. And then we must admit that it could very well be the case, but the mechanisms for this influence are not well understood presently. We don't know why, really. First of all, we must illustrate the fact that the violin and bow are not tightly coupled mechanical systems. So the conditions for the properties of a bow, the mechanical properties of a bow to influence the string, are not so favorable. And this illustration is made by listening to the vibrations in the tip of the bow. We had a sensor glued to the tip. And you will hear glissando due to the resonances in the bow hair. And they are visible in the spectrograms as well. You heard the glissando in both cases, and these bright lines are the fundamental and the first overtone, and then the fundamental in this case. And these glissando are caused by longitudinal resonances in the bow hair between the tip and the contact point with the string. And as you move the bow, the length of the bow hair changes continuously, giving the glissando. And if the coupling was a little stronger between the bow and string, these glissando would be heard. They would be transferred to the string vibrations, and they would be a component of a radiated sound from the violin. And that's not a popular repertoire to play, glissando all the time. So in a sense, it's good that this coupling is not so tight. But now, in order to try to understand how the bow, properties of the bow possibly could influence the timbre of violin, we have to look at the resonance of the bow, and they are expressed in terms of mobility of the bow hair. Mobility has to do with how easily a structure is set in vibration for a certain force. So here is the bow, here's a mobility curve of a violin bow from 0 to 10 kilohertz. And each peak represents a resonance. We'll talk about that in a minute. We see immediately that the bow has many resonances. Here's a 6, 7, and here is one broad. And in principle, they could modulate the velocity here, in local velocity, exactly at the contact point with the string, shaking the bow locally. So that would be possible to influence the string vibrations. That could be a possibility. However, there is a mismatch in mobility. So all these resonances, which belong to flexural resonances with stick, and this peak here, which is a longitudinal resonance in the bow hair, the average mobility for these, somewhere here, are far below the average mobility of a string. There's a gap in mobility here. And according to the laws of physics, such systems can't exchange energy easily. So the bow might well vibrate rather much, but it can't be transferred to the string in an efficient way. The bow is, so to speak, too heavy and the string too light for such interaction to occur. So it can be concluded that whatever goes on in the bow hair is not transferred to the string, and a lot goes on in the bow hair, as we just heard. We heard the glissando, but they were unwanted effects. But there might well be other things that we would like to include in the sound of the violin, perhaps. So they are not tightly coupled mechanical systems. These results can be verified by computer simulations as well, and we will not dwell on the details here. But what has been observed so far are only small, minor influences on the properties of the bow, on the resonant properties of the bow, on the string vibrations. So from a physical standpoint, there is no good explanation to the statement by professional players that the properties of the bow, the resonant properties of the bow, influence the sound of the violin. But they are probably right. Professionals are always right in their answers related to music and musical sounds. It's the interpretation we are missing at the moment. So we took another perspective of this bow issue by a listening test. And it runs as follows. Does the bow influence the sound of a violin? Yes, indeed, according to players. But what about when they don't play, just listen? Because when playing, they are in the loop and has much more information available because they compensate or use the properties of bow in a sensible way. And they miss that information when they are listening only. So perhaps it's not the actual sound and timbre of the bow which is judged in such playing tests. So let's make a pure listening test instead. And for that purpose, we used a set of assorted bows with starting at one extreme with an excellent bow, and a good fine French bow, very expensive, 6,000 euro. And that was, in the other extreme, they had the catastrophe, the standard of badness for bows, I think. It was a short and light bow of unknown wood with very bad bow hair. Everything was wrong, even the curvature in this part. Completely useless. And the professional had recorded short melodic fragments using all bows, and they were then presented pairwise to other professionals, and the task was to discriminate the two bows used in that pair, a normal ABX test. And here are the results of the best worst case. The excellent bow, this, contrasted against the worst case, this. And the result is a little surprising. 3 of 8 violinists this, and this, could discriminate between the worthless bows and the excellent bow. The others could not. You needed 12 correct answers in this test out of 16. Surprising, and you will probably do better because now you can listen. You will listen to the best and worst bow. One is A, and the other is B. And your task is to decide if X is either B is A or B. Let's go. Well, it's not so easy. You can wait a little with the answer and listen to another melody, the same task, the same pair of bows are contrasted. Any opinions, A or B, in here? A, B, B. B is correct, and B is the excellent or the catastrophe. Yeah, you are better than the professionals. And it's the same in the next, for example. B is the correct answer, and B is the bad one. Yeah. But the interesting thing is that the difference is rather small. It's very small, in fact. This is not the final test in this regard, but it's a good indicator of what you could expect. So perhaps we can summarize the state of affairs so far. That does the bow influence the sound of the violin? Yes, but perhaps not so much, and we don't know how yet. So what do you pay for? Here is one good bow for 12,500 euro. And 1 euro is 1.3 Canadian dollars. Perhaps you play for another quality, playability, which is a completely different issue compared to the influence on timbre. I don't know. Yep. No, that should not. Perhaps we should spend a few minutes more on the next. Last thing, look at the bowing angles. These are measurements by Erwin Schondewald here at McGill, and for a couple of years ago, and new measurements were at his new workplace in Hanover. It deals with the bowing angles. We talked about the tilt earlier. Now it's the inclination, which changes the string played, and the skewness of the bow in this direction. And here we identify Lambert-Chen. So would you please step forward and play a little of this? Please. Yeah. Thank you. And in the mocap visualization, you can get these nice views from a player's perspective, showing a different inclination sectors where you play different strings. So mocap is very interesting for these purposes, useful. And we will have time for one example. Skewed bowing. Skewed bow, the bow is not at right angle at the string, so here the bow is really skewed. And that's, as we said, there has been some controversies about that. What does it really mean? What happens if a bow is not perpendicular to the string? Well, we have 9 sketches here. So here is sketch 1, the release. The bow has been drawn to the side during the sticking phase of the Helmholtz motion. The bow has a certain angle, a certain skewness compared to the straight bowing. Now it's time for release. So the bow slips under the string slips under the bow, and this to this point where the capture takes place. And now the string is drawn aside again during a stick, and it's time for the release now. And here it slips again, and the new contact point is here, and then it's drawn aside. End of stick phase. So during these 2 periods, the contact point between the bow and string has drifted away towards the fingerboard. And automatically, the player hasn't done anything because of the skewing angle. Very convenient, because skewed bow can be used for changing bowing distance, bow bridge distance. So if the bow is skewed in this way and make a down bow, it will drift towards the fingerboard. And if you make an up bow, it will drift the other way, and the other way around. So it's only with straight bow you have a stable position on the string. Very good. Here are motion captures. That crescendo diminuendo, here it starts in a down bow in a diminuendo and then changes to a crescendo. And watch the skewness on the bow in the diminuendo crescendo. So that skewness is used for changing the bow bridge distance. And the other way around, starting down bow, so you have a crescendo first. Once again. Convenient way of using the bow physics to change the bow bridge distance. Here is a famous violin player, and he makes a diminuendo, and then followed by a crescendo, then a diminuendo again. And watch his skewness. Diminuendo, crescendo, diminuendo. Once again, diminuendo, crescendo, and diminuendo. So straight bowing is not used very often. The bow is almost skewed almost all over time. Yes, I think we should leave some things here and out of discussion. We can take that during questions, and I think, yeah, we should do that. Let's see now. Yeah, again, the final message. Coordination between the bowing parameters, that's the key issue to success. And by that, I finish. Thank you for your attention.